Welcome to the next episode of Meet a Cheetah, where we meet members of our staff and care team. Today's special guest is Dr. Nicholas Canby, aka Nick, and he's going to walk us through who he is and how he ended up at Cheetah House. So, welcome, Nick.
Thank you.
So, let's start at the beginning. Where did you grow up? Like, who are you? Tell us about like the beginnings of Nick Canby.
Sure. So it's a pleasure to be here, first of all. I have been involved in Cheetah House for a few years, and my trajectory initially brought me through the lab at Brown that Dr. Britton leads. Starting way at the beginning, I grew up in Western Massachusetts in kind of a small college town called Northampton. Um, and Yeah, I think from an early age, I was kind of exposed to a lot of different sort of religious ideologies and traditions, and like from a fairly early age, was interested in exploring religion, spiritual experience, later on contemplative practices.
And so, where do you want to start? Maybe your educational background. Tell us about like how that, or how did you end up working in my lab?
Yeah, good question. So I first worked in your lab in 2012, and at that time, I had actually just graduated from undergrad. I went to Beloit College in Wisconsin, and did my senior honors thesis on mindfulness-based stress reduction. So I actually like co-taught a MBSR course in my as part of my undergrad thesis. And I think through word of mouth, I heard about your lab, and um, I had kind of gotten into Theravada Buddhist philosophy at that time and sort of like was exploring a bunch of different kind of spiritual philosophies and practices. And your lab really appealed to me also because of, I think, the emphasis on like not just kind of like purely clinical scientific focus, but like interface with Buddhist philosophy um, and kind of like non-Western ideas, which was something I was really interested in at the time. So I applied to your lab and got accepted as a summer intern. Um, and then after that, it's been a number of times that I've like went away, did something else, and then have come back. So yeah, I think it's sort of a long story, but I came back again in 2015 and then went to grad school and then came back again after grad school. And yeah, it's been kind of a long history from there.
Okay. So we'll come back to the lab and the research that you've done in the lab because that's pretty extensive. Actually, I went through my list of publications today because I was updating my CV because of this new publication, and I counted that Nick and I have co-authored 9 publications together. So I think we're gonna have to unpack some of those because some of them are actually quite important papers, and so I think people would be really interested to hear about that. But that's coming next. So it sounds like even before you got to the lab, I did not convert you. You were already interested in Eastern philosophy, meditation. Had you already started practicing? Like, what were you doing?
Yeah, I had been, I started that kind of interest, I'd say like kind of later high school, early college. I started reading a bunch of different kind of spiritually oriented books at that time. And I think it was really driven by like a sense of, curiosity, kind of like wanting to explore different types of experiences that are possible, or like kind of curiosity about like how the world worked. I wasn't particularly like rigid about any one of them. I was kind of more just exploratory, I think. Um, and I read like a bunch of the kind of Carlos Castaneda books that got me kind of into some of the altered states and like shamanism type stuff. I also read, I think, like some Thich Nhat Hanh books about like the miracle of mindfulness and um the you know I was actually not particularly focused on Theravada Buddhism, but I did later in college heard about like Goenka Vipassana retreats, and I did a Vipassana retreat. I think like in my final year of college. And so that kind of like was my first exposure to Theravada Buddhism. Um,
And what was that experience like? Because as you know, the Goenka retreats are some of the ones that show up at Cheetah House more frequently than others. How was that retreat for you?
yeah, I mean, so it was very intense and really challenging to be honest. I had so it was also kind of funny in retrospect. I don't think I had fully understood this at the time, but so I had been really into or I had started learning more about like mindfulness-based stress reduction and the more kind of secular approaches to meditation. And when I went to the Goenka Vipassana retreat, I thought that that would be sort of like the next step up, where they would kind of like see me as this college kid and they're like, oh, cool, you're so into this other stuff. And like, this is, they'd kind of like congratulated me on that almost. And instead, because I had indicated that I was doing some like other mindfulness practice, the assistant teacher kind of took me aside and was like, you can't do that anymore. Like, that stuff is bad. Like, you got to only do going to Vipassana. Um, which was very surprising at the time and kind of like a little confusing. Um, so that was, I think, one of the early experiences I had that like sometimes in the sort of modern kind of American or Western sort of spiritual marketplace, all of these things are considered to be like just the same stuff. And it was kind of striking to realize like, oh no, there's actually like a bunch of differences here. Um, the other thing actually was that I had a bunch of like allergies during my first Vipassana retreat, and I couldn't breathe through my nose very well.
Mm.
And I kept, I mean, this was just an interesting little tidbit about like how kind of rigid I see that tradition now, that the assistant teachers basically told me like there's no other way to meditate besides breathing through my nostrils. But I couldn't breathe through my nostrils because my nose was stuffy. And they were just like, no, you can't breathe through your mouth. Like you have to breathe through your nostrils. But they didn't give me any other option. I was just kind of like, so I'm sitting there trying to like breathe through a stuffy nose for like, oh,
Hours.
yeah.
Yeah.
So that was just like, it was kind of interesting to, they're very like, here is the technique, do it this way. And if it's not working, there's no alternative. I got a little taste of that at the time. It wasn't enough to like dissuade me from that tradition. I ended up doing a few other retreats with them. Um, I think four total Vipassana, Goenka Vipassana retreats I've done. But anyway, that was just kind of like a preview to some of the things that I later learned.
hmm You get that the message over and over again. Keep learning the same thing. Okay, so you've started doing some practices. You've read widely on various types of spiritual traditions, altered states. Anything else before you kind of joined the lab for the first time?
Um, no, not really. I think I was kind of, I mean, so my I had kind of grown up with my my dad, for example, lived in Indonesia for 3 years when he was like in his early 20s, and then he lived in like a yoga ashram at a certain point. So I kind of grew up with like some of that being a bit normalized for me, and hearing a lot about sort of the kind of movements in the 70s in America, and so that was something that was kind of familiar to me, and also probably um, my own interests in those areas were like partly that I was exposed a lot to those kind of ideas as a child and adolescent.
You had hippie parents.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
Um, okay, so you come to the lab, and I mean, I remember like when you applied that you had done basically a clinical trial for your honors thesis as an undergrad, right? You ran a trial.
Yeah, and it ended up getting published actually with your encouragement. Yeah.
Yeah, which is like very unusual. So I was like, okay, this guy's got some good follow through and is obviously very capable at a young age. So that was one of the reasons that I took him on. And I think we can probably skip just getting into the details and the weeds of what you did that first year, but then you left again, and where did you go after that?
So after I was in your lab, like shortly after, actually, I ended up living in South America for 3 years, and lived in Peru in the Amazon jungle. Spent some time living with a traditional healer there. Ended up teaching English in Brazil, and then, eventually moved back and was interested in applying to grad school and kind of reconnected with you, as part of like getting more experience in psychology to be able to like apply to grad school.
Mhm. And so, yeah, tell me about graduate school and your clinical training.
So I got into a clinical psychology PhD program at Clark University, which is in Worcester, Massachusetts, and conveniently also not that far away from Providence, where your lab was. So we kind of like stayed in touch throughout grad school, still working together. Um, and yeah, so I continued doing research on mindfulness meditation and that kind of related to an interest in like altered states, anomalous experiences, kind of changes in sense of self that are unusual, as well as kind of like understanding basically what are the therapeutic factors that like lead to mindfulness-based interventions or just interventions in general, like actually working to help people. And also, when do those types of interventions cause harms, like adverse effects? Um, so again, like, worked on a few different papers. Each one had a different topic, but those are some of the things that were most interesting to me. I also,
So when we dive into the research, I'm not going to be able to stop myself. So I want to make sure we get like all of your clinical training covered before we go into the research. So tell me about your clinical training, what types of interventions you're trained in, what you feel comfortable with, like what you offer, what you like. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I feel really quite happy with the clinical training that I've received over time. So we started in grad school really getting thorough training in an approach called ACT, or like acceptance and commitment therapy. And then after that time, I've worked in a number of different like placements, and gotten kind of more specialized training in a few different areas. So I would say overall, um, so I did my clinical internship, which is like kind of like a residency for clinical psych PhD programs, at the VA, and got a lot of training in working with veterans who have trauma or PTSD. Um, I've also gotten a good amount of training with couples therapy, and um, and I think acceptance and commitment therapy is like one of the sort of approaches that I use probably the most often in some sense. I find it a really versatile kind of framework that a lot of other techniques can be kind of understood within that overall framework. Um, but yeah, I've also been trained in like CBT approaches. You know, I guess I would say that a lot of these evidence-based kind of protocols like ACT, oh, didn't mention DBT, but I also worked in like a partial hospital program for DBT that used DBT for people with BPD, borderline personality disorder. Um, and yeah, I also worked in like a inpatient unit working with like suicide prevention therapy as well. I would say that a lot of these like different sort of evidence-based protocols are like, a lot of people think about therapy as like you just kind of go in and talk about your week or something. And I think that it can be that, and that's like absolutely fine if that's what you want it to be. But I feel like the benefit of a lot of these different tools is like that they can be used um, first with a foundation of like just being present with someone, listening to them, wanting to know more about their story is kind of the foundation of all therapeutic work. Um, but some of these other tools are kind of like once you have that foundation, then there's like other ways of working with someone that can really help to make progress towards a particular goal. Like if someone has really debilitating symptoms, there's like pretty evidence-based technique, like pretty good evidence-based techniques that can help them in that way. So I've been trained in a number of different modalities for that. Um,
Yeah, it kind of blows my mind that therapy, like meditation, like has been kind of thrown all into this one bucket that you're like, I have a therapist, so everything's fine. And I see so many people that they really need like a very targeted intervention, for things like OCD or anxiety. Like you can't just talk that out with your therapist. Like there's very specific interventions for that. And people can spend years just kind of talking about their week, and that's not necessarily going to get them anywhere. So yeah, it's another interesting thing. So let's talk about your dissertation. Let's start the research journey with your dissertation, which was not your first paper, but I think it's one that really is your first thing that you did on your own. And I will say that Nick and I share a passion for alterations in sense of self. We both have like a very specific interest in that. So he's one of the few people that can like really talk shop with me, and I really appreciate that. So, yeah, tell me about what triggered this, idea for your thesis, and also, the two papers that you have that are sort of in process, or one of them's published, kind of what you found.
mhm. Yeah, yeah. So I think that the sort of trigger of the idea is that there's, a lot of different types of changes in sense of self that are talked about in the literature about like, people talk about ego dissolution or ego death. Um, there's also people who, a lot of Buddhist traditions talk about the sense of no self or selflessness. There's also this kind of other literature that talks about mystical experiences. And when you really look at like what all those mean, especially like in the kind of academic context, there's like a lot of like vagueness and like not a lot of clarity about like what exactly is ego death or what are we talking about? Like, is that the same as depersonalization or dissociation, or is that something different? And like what level of like sense of self are we talking about? So honestly, I think that like part of the idea for the study was like that I was actually coming to like Cheetah House support groups a lot at the time, and I was trying to like understand, trying to go around in my own head about like, there's a lot of different types of experiences that we're talking about. Some of those types of experiences, I'm reading in the literature lead to positive outcomes. And I'm also talking to a lot of people at Cheetah House who are talking about or like very destabilizing, difficult outcomes. So I was trying to like kind of figure out is this something different that's happening, or is it all about the context, or is it like all about the level of sense of self, or like what differentiates those two, and how can we better understand like what's going on here?
And one of the things that you discovered was that the literature itself, meaning the way that these states are described and measured itself, was a problem.
Hmm.
Can you say more about that?
Sure, yeah. So I mean, I think that there's also a really interesting sort of historical trajectory about how mystical experiences have been defined and measured. So, it, so for those of you who aren't familiar with the concept of mystical experience, there's kind of like mystical experience in the more broad term of like, most people who are not academics might consider a mystical experience to be like synonymous with just like having a spiritual experience. Um, but in the kind of like academic literature, if you say mystical experience, it actually refers to something really narrow and specific. And it's kind of a strange kind of strategic move that they defined it in this way that seeks to kind of take what was perceived as like cultural baggage out of all these different religious traditions and make mystical experience into something that like transcends culture. So a mystical experience is an experience that is involves like union with everything, a loss of sense of individuality, positive affect, and certain kind of ways of interpreting that experience that are generally positive. And because they combine it with positive affect, if you experience that same thing, but it's not positive, then like according to the way it's defined, that wouldn't be a mystical experience, which is like a very sort of odd um, and sort of ideologically motivated way of defining it. Um,
I mean, it also sounds like it's kind of a loaded research question if you want to investigate whether, is a mystical experience, sort of therapeutic, right? Is it therapeutic? But if it's already got a positive, emotion and outcome built into the definition, then that is a foregone, that's it's already loaded into the measurement that it's going to be good for you because that's part of what the definition is. So, yeah.
exactly, yeah. And yeah, and I learned also a lot of sort of looking at that really closely from you. But yeah, that was so basically my initial question was about some like are these experiences positive or negative or how to tell whether they are positive or negative. And then I think what happened is that in order to really ask that question, I had to really pull apart the concepts themselves because the way that the concept is like defined and measured was, like you said, is like assuming a certain type of like positivity and interpretation that you couldn't really like you kind of have to separate that to be able to ask if it's positive or negative.
And so I remember when we were going through actually line by line, the items on these questionnaires, and that like just the slight difference in wording, made a difference as to whether it was associated with a positive outcome or a negative outcome. So, what were the takeaways from that first paper, which is about like issues of measurement? What were some of the things that would be good to share with people so they can get a sense of like where we're at?
Yeah. I mean, so one of the takeaways is that what people typically call a mystical experience, or like the concept that we've been talking about in the academic literature, is really not just one thing. I think we separated it into 16 different factors. Um, and I won't be able to go through all of those right now, but like basically there were a bunch of different ways that the self can be altered. And there were also different forms of like emotion and interpretation and response to those self alterations that like can be different as well. So someone can experience a sense of unity with everything. Someone can also experience a loss of individuality. Um, Someone can experience something that is more um, like a disconnection with their body. Um, And yeah, there's quite a lot of variability there. I think that some of the like broad trends that we found through the study were that um, one of them was actually that like changes in sense of self by themselves were actually not predictive of either positive or negative outcomes. But it was much more about a couple of like secondary factors. And one of it was like how much someone felt like connected to themselves in the world versus disconnected or kind of like alone in their head. That was like one of the things. Being more connected was more associated with positive outcomes, being more disconnected associated with negative outcomes. I think another one was like, sorry, it's been a little while. I'm trying to recall exactly, but I think it was uh, the interpretation or emotional response was more important than the actual experience itself. So if you feel blissful, if you feel like the experience revealed something important or insightful to you, then that was more likely to be positive. If you feel like it was not, if you're like emotionally numb and shut down or felt terrified by it, then you're less likely to feel like it had any therapeutic value. And also those factors even were related to like whether someone was interested in pursuing that experience or whether it just like happened out of the blue. So I think that like one of the takeaways is that context matters a lot and like motivation matters a lot. Um, and it's actually really hard to make like a general statement like this particular type of experience is going to have the same effect for everyone because like it's such an individual thing.
I mean, one of the things I remember from that paper, and I don't know if I can't remember whether I actually got this line in the paper or not, but was something about the way that the items were worded, that if it was worded like the loss of self was more like an expansion, like I merged with everything.
Hmm.
Like so the sense of I, the sense of individual I is gone, but it's also much bigger. So there's like an expansion of the I rather than a diminishment. And there were certain items that were like that were much more of like the self was diminished, or and that those ones tended to be more negative, and the ones that were more expansive or larger ended up going in a more positive direction, which in some ways is like a complete contradiction to the idea of no self, that like obliterating and annihilating yourself is going to like end really well. And it's like, well, actually, if you really look at the way the questions are asked, it's really more about like expanding the sense of self, that sort of goes in the positive direction. So it's not the self getting smaller really, but bigger. So I don't know if I can if we got quite that far, but it seemed to be that's what I remember from that paper.
Yeah, that was one of the findings, and I kind of like consider that to be a little bit part of the like the connectedness dimension as well. Like, but I think it also there's some of these experiences are hard to put into words because sometimes people described feeling like their sense of self expanded so much that they became everything, and then everything and nothing are sort of like two sides of the same coin almost. Um, but then there were others who said it wasn't really like an expansion, it was more of like the barrier between self and other kind of went away. Um, and then there were others who felt like it was like not expansion
Mhm.
or sort of a loss of individuality. It was more like they just felt alone and distanced. Um,
The boundary thing reminds me that you also found that um, the boundarylessness was often a positive thing,
mhm.
like merging with other things, but like it sort of depends on what you merge with, right? Because
Oh
if
yeah.
you're merging with some other neurotic person, then sharing the mind states of another person who that could be feel very like claustrophobic or intrusive, or like you're having your boundaries violated by someone else. So I wonder whether, yeah, that was another, like it makes sense when you think about it, but it's the rhetoric is so strong about like, if you have no boundaries, everything will be good. And you're like, that makes no sense actually. So yeah.
Yeah, totally. And I think also, so I think there was like having no boundaries with like all things was actually separate from having no boundaries with other people, and that was separate from having no boundaries with physical objects. And um and I think it was the no boundaries with other people that was like a little bit more distressing for some people. Like some people like what you're talking about, I think there are like reports of like feeling like there was like emotional contagion that like you couldn't really like keep other people's stuff to themselves.
I mean, so I call that hyper empathy. And that was definitely one of the side effects I had from meditating, where I would basically start, yeah, the emotions of other people I could just take them on. They would be like, I was permeable to them. And actually, as a therapist, that's a terrible thing, especially if you work in an inpatient psych hospital. So, um, yeah, I can imagine that one not being desirable.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so anything else about your dissertation? I know that the second paper, which is sort of the outcomes paper, is still in the pipeline. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Well, there was one, so I'll just kind of go in order of the things that Nick has worked on. Some of them were like really interesting questions and not very interesting answers. So one of them was, what predicts whether somebody like continues to meditate after they do MBCT? Um, it wasn't a very interesting answer. It was basically like conscientiousness and depression. Like they don't feel well, so they want to keep doing something to make them feel better, and they are very high achieving, sort of conscientious people. So, not that interesting. Um, but one of the most interesting paper that you first authored was a social factors paper. So tell us about that.
Yeah, that paper really kind of changed my view of some of these like meditation related interventions, to be honest. So we looked at um, whether it was essentially the meditation that was causing people to improve, or whether improvement in depression symptoms related to meditation based. This was like MBCT, which is mindfulness based cognitive therapy. That's an 8-week course where people meditate like 45 minutes a day. Um, and basically, there's some theory that there's these like common therapeutic factors, like being part of a therapeutic group, having a good relationship with the instructor, having like a therapeutic good relationship with the other group members, um, finding something that is like personally insightful through the group, or like expressing emotion in a safe way. Um, that are these factors are essentially like present throughout like almost every type of therapy, whether it's meditation based or not. And so we were asking like, was the improvement related more to these common social factors, or was it related more to like the amount that they actually meditated? And so the results were kind of interesting that like the amount that people meditated in the 8-week intervention actually had like zero relationship with the amount that they improved in depression. Um, Whereas the ratings of like how much they rated these different common or like social factors, like their quality of their relationships in the intervention, that was like very highly related to whether they improved in depression. So I mean, I think that this kind of said to me that uh, these common factors are probably more important than the meditation itself. Which honestly kind of to me makes sense as well that like 8 weeks is not that long. And um, I think that meditation can have pretty strong impacts on the brain and mind, but like in an 8-week intervention, it's like, is it really about the meditation or is it just like a therapy group? And
But I
yeah,
think it's confusing because often we just hear the word mindfulness class. And there are mindfulness classes and apps where there is no group, it is just the practice. And so, but those same apps and programs, they borrow data from MBSR and MBCT, which are, in person in a group with a teacher or maybe two teachers. So and then they say, oh, like mindfulness works. But our data suggests that it wasn't the mindfulness at all. It was, a teacher who had managed to, cure their own depression or anxiety with something. And that there was hope there. There was an example. There was a safe place. There was all these other things besides meditation. So I think it can be, confusing when you start to, think when it's called a mindfulness intervention when really the active ingredient wasn't actually the meditation.
yeah, absolutely. I think yeah, it really showed that these are like therapy interventions that include some meditation. And I think that they should really, the results, which generally are like, people improve from them, but like, um, they also improve from a lot of other therapy interventions. And I got really into the common factors literature that like essentially a lot of the time that like if you compare one of these like a mental health intervention to a placebo control where they're not doing anything, then usually it shows that the intervention works. But if you compare it to another like legitimate form of therapy, it is often the case that they both work equally well. And so the theory there would be like maybe it's just because they both have these kind of common therapy factors. And so the specific technique is kind of like the icing on the cake. It's not really like what's actually driving the results.
And then the one other thing from that paper was that this it was an MBCT course, but it was also a dismantling trial. So we actually compared MBCT, which is a combination of concentration and insight, to concentration only and then insight only. So we basically had another factor, which was the type of meditation, not just the amount. And we also found that type of meditation didn't matter either. So, yeah, interesting.
Yeah, that definitely added sort of added fuel to the same argument for sure. Yeah. That, yeah, that it might not really be the meditation or the technique that is like leading to the outcomes.
So I'm looking at just kind of going in order. I'm not going to go through all of his 9 publications, but Nick was also a co-author on the Defining and Measuring Meditation-Related Adverse Effects in Mindfulness-Based Interventions, which was published in Clinical Psych Science. Basically, a best practices paper on how to measure and mitigate adverse effects. And then so Nick inherited a lot of like orphaned papers that were started by somebody else, and then they usually graduated and they left their thesis behind, and so Nick kind of came along and finished those up. But one of the ones that you inherited was a paper that I had been working on. It was a meta-analysis review paper on it's the same question that we've been asking all along, which is okay, we keep hearing that self-related processes are somehow related to the therapeutic outcome in mindfulness-based interventions, but like which ones? Because there's so many ways that the self can change and there's so many senses of self out there. So let's get really like in the weeds. And so we went down the rabbit hole, and we published a paper called From Self-Esteem to Selflessness, an evidenced gap map of self-related processes as mechanisms of mindfulness-based intervention. So this was very much in your wheelhouse, which is why you were invited to work on it. Do you remember any of the sections that you worked on and what you found?
Yeah, so I think I worked a lot on the section on interoception and which is like body sensation awareness. And also on like self-transcendent experiences. Um, and a little bit on the rest of the paper, but those were the parts that I focused on. And yeah, I mean, honestly, one of the things that really struck me about writing that paper was that there's a lot of like media talk about um, the effects of meditation on some of these, or like kind of assumptions of like meditation relates to like these types of experiences or becoming more aware of your body. But when you really get down to the nitty-gritty like evidence, it's pretty sparse for a lot of for especially senses of self. And that was just interesting to see how little like strong evidence there actually was. I mean, most of the strong evidence was in another part of the paper on like self-esteem, which is kind of quite different from the typical narrative about no self. And so I think like you kind of see this like mixing together certain Buddhist ideas with kind of a scientific paradigm, but then like not a lot of like actual investigation whether there's really evidence behind the no self idea or like or how that would really be defined in a scientific context. Um,
I remember that we use certain criteria because there are like, sort of official criteria for what can constitutes evidence and like a lot of evidence, high levels of evidence. And so the highest level would be a meta-analysis made of randomized controlled trials. And then it kind of goes down the lower, to lower levels of like correlation studies or one single person study or just a observational study. And I remember when we got to the more changes in bodily self, like changes in your sense of boundary boundary loss, that we couldn't find a single randomized clinical trial not even one. We had to go all the way down to like, single story, single uh, person studies. So that was, yeah, kind of surprising.
Yeah, yeah. No, there's really not. Well, I mean, I think that that is kind of a growing area right now because some of those more like intensively altered types of experiences, like losing your sense of boundaries, are a little bit easier to study with psychedelics. So there's kind of a growing area of scientific literature on those, experiences in that context now. But in meditation, I was kind of surprised to see it's mostly like much more qualitative, like accounts of experiences of intensive meditators, but not a lot. I mean, I think that there's a real disconnect between the more like clinically oriented 8 week like intervention type research versus like having an intensive meditator describe their experience, which is not really very clinical. It's much more like descriptive.
And so, one thing I want people to know about you is that you're not just a meditation researcher. That your dissertation, especially, looked at a lot of different triggers of changes in sense of self, including psychedelics and trauma. I just wanted to put that out there that you have some overlap with psychedelics, and there was one paper that you published with Roman Politsky last year. We were both co-authors on it, called "Leveraging Meditation Research for the Study of Psychedelic-Related Adverse Effects," and just a comment on what that paper was, why it came about.
Yeah, and that's really kind of leading to actually a project that we're currently working on about kind of using some of the research that you and the lab has conducted on meditation-related adverse effects, and kind of using that as a way of better understanding psychedelic-related adverse effects. There's a lot of commonalities, and that area of research is less developed. Um, yeah, that's definitely an area I'm interested in. And I think, overall, I've had a strong interest in like altered states and changes in senses of self and other kind of altered or anomalous experiences. So it kind of fits well with the emerging area of psychedelics. So yeah, kind of have those as like dual interests.
Okay, two papers left. These were just published, so 2025 publications. One was childhood trauma and subclinical PTSD predict adverse effects and worse outcomes across two mindfulness-based programs for active depression. What was that one about? Well, obviously, what was it about? What did you find?
Yeah, so that one was essentially it was looking at two different randomized controlled trials that were conducted by you in the lab, and they found that people with more adverse childhood experiences improved less in their depression scores. And also in one of them, it was actually the same data set that looked at like uh, adverse effects from 8 week interventions. And it turned out that people essentially had a greater occurrence of like challenging or anomalous or adverse effects if they had had childhood trauma. Um, and so, I think it really kind of calls for meditation related interventions to be more trauma sensitive. Um, it also kind of fits with like trauma and a sort of framework of understanding trauma is like related to dysregulation in the nervous system and also altered states relating to dysregulation in the nervous system. So people who maybe have some prior dysregulation there might be more likely to like get into a dysregulated state. Um, I also want to be a little careful to say it's not trying to imply that like meditation related challenges are only related to like past trauma, because I think that's something that sometimes can be used to sort of dismiss the role of meditation itself in leading to challenges. And so it's not what we were trying to do through this paper, but like still past trauma can play a role.
Yep. And I think, David Trelevins wrote an entire book about that, but here's some data to support his ideas. Okay, last paper. And this, for those of you who came late, this was went open access today, like just before this meeting. So this is hot off the press. And this is called The Teacher Matters, the Role and Impact of Meditation Teachers in the Trajectories of Western Buddhist Meditators Experiencing Meditation-Related Challenges. So, yeah, tell us about the role of the
Yeah,
teachers.
so this is a paper based on data from the Varieties of Contemplative Experience project, which is kind of the main qualitative project that you and the lab have been working on for many years now. I think this paper this took a long time to finish. I think I was working on this since 2016 maybe, and it like just got published. So this is like almost a decade of work. Um, and Yeah, this is really it's meant to be really looking at like how teachers, meditation teachers can be both a resource and a huge help to people experiencing challenges and also can be really destabilizing at times. And so it looks at like both how they provide support or how they don't provide support. Um, and the interviews were actually with both practitioners and with teachers. So we have like perspectives of both in this paper. And then certain like relationship dynamics kind of became apparent through certain narratives. Um, Also questions of like expertise, like are meditation teachers supposed to be the ones to deal with this, or is this something more for mental health practitioners to deal with? And there's kind of like some nuanced conversations about that. Um, and Yeah, also some like tradition specific commentary, certain dynamics that are like um, power dynamics, dynamics of like trust and intimacy and yeah, so those are some of the ideas mentioned in this paper. It's a really uh complex paper that I really encourage people to take a look at it because it's hard to give a summary of the entire thing.
Yeah, a very important paper. And then the last paper, which isn't even published yet, but is in the pipeline, is the paper that you worked on with Josie, which was on the role of diet. Um, More than 90% of people and teachers mentioned diet as an influencing factor, but it wasn't something that we thought about like when we were planning the study. And so, what were the take homes from that?
Yeah, the take homes from that were that people often described eating like hot, heavy, like meat heavy diets as leading to kind of a grounding experience. And the way I kind of make sense of it is that often like the context and the diet and the amount of sleep and all of that stuff in a meditation retreat is kind of designed to like lead people in a kind of ungrounding direction in some ways. Like it's because also that if you're kind of becoming less grounded, you're also more likely to have like certain types of unusual experiences or I think that there is a sense of like a lot of these retreat settings are kind of intentionally leading people away from like something that is grounded. And so eating a lot of meat, eating heavy food, it's like often the exactly the opposite of what like retreats have people do. And it seems to like have the opposite effect as well of like leading people away from um, a really hyper aroused state or a state where you're kind of disconnected from reality in certain ways or disconnected from yourself. Um, Again, it's really just qualitative, so this is kind of a preliminary finding, but I found that really kind of interesting.
I mean, it definitely rings true in my experience. I mean, every retreat I've ever been on, I was hungry the whole time, and I didn't feel like anything that they fed me was yeah, it was heavy enough. Like I needed protein. And so I was eating all the peanut butter and, like the beans and the things, but I tend to eat a lot of fat and protein outside of retreats. And so it was a really big deviation from my normal diet. And I always get like yeah, super like just floaty, more kind of prone to dissociation. Um, I mean, I imagine that serving vegetarian is cheaper. I imagine that it also kind of goes with a certain ethic or value system of being like, I don't know, eating vegetarian is also not killing animals, and it's like, it's more in line with some of the precepts. Um, do you think meditation centers should offer meat?
I mean, I don't know if it's like one thing is always better than another. I think it's more of like you have different options that could lead in different mental directions. And I think like I mean, I don't really know. I think maybe meat should be offered if someone's becoming ungrounded. Um I think it depends a little bit on like what the goal of the practice and tradition is, like what the kind of but I do think that I think that certain traditions actually attempt to cultivate that kind of like spacey sort of like feeling. Like often you're waking up at like 4 in the morning and you're meditating all day and you're eating like only salad. And like I think that all of those things together like definitely lead to kind of like a little bit of a spacey sort of like slightly um hypnagogic or like very sensitized kind of state of mind, which I think is probably cultivated, like purposefully. And maybe there's some benefits to that in certain contexts, but also that can be really destabilizing too. So I think it's good to know like what the levers are in a way of like how, if you're pulling the levers to bring someone to that state, what are the levers to like bring them back down? Um, So I guess I don't know if there's like a one size fits all if like every retreat center should be serving meat all the time, but like I think it's a helpful thing to know that like maybe serving meat would help someone who's like gone a little too far in the spacey direction to like to find some grounding.
Yep. I definitely sneak out for the hamburger, I admit. Um, all right. Well, as you can see, Nick is an extremely accomplished and knowledgeable researcher and scholar. But let's swing back to Cheetah House because we're kind of wrapping up our little interview here. You are a licensed clinical psychologist and you have a private practice, but you also are on the care team. You did the 100-hour care team training a number of years ago. And so tell us about, the kinds of clients you see or want to see at Cheetah House. Nick is accepting new clients. So tell us about the types of clients that you love to see, your favorite types.
Yeah, good question. Honestly, I kind of like working with people who have like a little bit more severe types of like things they're going through. And I don't mean that to say like, of course, I don't want them to be going through that, but like I find it really interesting when I am encountered with something, when I encounter something that's like a little bit unusual, like some kind of altered state that is often people don't really know what to make of. And I find it really, I mean, I also find it really meaningful to like be able to like provide some guidance or help to someone in that, maybe someone who doesn't really know what's happening to them and needs a little bit of like some of the research, some of the kind of orientation about like what is um uh how to maybe understand what's happening or how to help. With that said, I mean, I especially feel competent in dealing with senses of self, depersonalization, yeah, just kind of like altered states in general, and trauma as well. I think those are kind of like areas of specialty for me, but I'm feel fairly comfortable in seeing some of the more severe cases in general as well.
And you're also helping out with some of the supervision. So the care team meets at least once a month to talk about clients and make sure that we share information and give each other suggestions. So Nick is also helping out with that as a clinician. Anything else that you want to say about your role at Cheetah House or where you're hoping Cheetah House goes?
Yeah, I mean, I've really enjoyed my time at Cheetah House. Working with the Cheetah House care team has just been really rewarding, and I feel like it's a really great group of people to just be interacting with. And I also just feel like it feels really valuable to be able to use some of the research expertise I've gathered, like to actually provide assistance to people. Otherwise, like, what's kind of the point of doing all that research? So uh, I'm, really, yeah, kind of grateful to be in this role and to be able to help this organization that feels really important because a lot of the people I see feel like, they've talked to different people about this and don't really know what's happening to them or like what can be done or um, have a clear direction sometimes. And so to be able to give a little bit of orientation, if that's what people are looking for, um, I just think is really valuable. It feels meaningful to me anyway. Uh, and yeah, I'd really just love to see Cheetah House. I'm kind of involved in both the clinical side of Cheetah House, also the sort of educational arm, and seeing Cheetah House's offerings expand would be really cool. And hoping to kind of continue to play a role in like providing supervision and training and maybe some educational offerings. As some of the papers we talked about, maybe I'll give a talk on at some point. And yeah, those are some future directions I'd like to see.
Yeah, so Nick was also partially responsible for getting our educational materials accredited by the APA. So thank you for doing that. If you are a clinician, you can get continuing education credit through our online courses tab. And I don't want to promise anything, but we are talking about creating a training, sort of rebooting the First Do No Harm training, which was a 20-hour meditation safety training that I did with Jared Lindahl and David Trelevin. I think this edition will feature me and Nick and possibly Nathan Fisher, maybe other people from the care team. We were sort of planning that. So if that piques your interest, please, write in. There'll be a survey, an anonymous survey right after this call. So if you're interested in getting training, safety training, it's good for us to gauge how much interest we have. So it'll motivate us to get moving on that. So thank you so much, Nick. I think we're going to open it up for questions now.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. And I think honestly, I'd really invite you to maybe book a consult because it's a little hard to give like general one size fits all advice on that. And that really also is like I think like I wish I could, but there's so much nuance to, what's going on in your particular life and your particular context. So I wouldn't want to just say like, oh, everyone just do this one thing, because I think it's not quite so simple. But yeah, I'd be, more than happy to talk with you more one-on-one about this. I also do think that sometimes, people try a lot of spiritual practices to get more grounded, and sometimes spiritual practices are actually ungrounding. Sometimes it might mean just not doing any meditation or psychedelics or anything related to that, and maybe doing things more like gardening or physical work can sometimes uh, help to get more in the physical world and like kind of away from those kind of altered states. So what you're touching on is that there are a wide variety of ways of experiencing self or non-self, and also kind of like layers to that experience. So, what we often might think of as kind of this like more conceptual or narrative level of like the story of who I am or the personality that I have. Um, And that level of self is also very culturally based. And different cultures have very different senses of self in that sense. But then there's, other layers of self that are more like embodied, like the sense of like that I'm the owner of my body, or that I'm the one moving my body, or that I'm the one like kind of like watching behind my eyes. Maybe it's located in a different part of my body. Maybe I'm the one in my heart. Um, but that sense of like spatial self-location or like body ownership or agency um, might be different layers of self. Got it. Got it. Um, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different, perspectives and beliefs and ways of thinking that can be related to meditation, can also occur outside of meditation. So I think, do you feel like that is unhelpful for you to be seeing the world that way? I know I hear you, and I think that that type of experience, it might be considered, especially by mental health professionals, as like a as psychosis. There's also certain people who have experiences like that through like spiritual practices. And so it sounds like you're kind of like asking like which one is it? Is that a spiritual experience or is that a psychotic experience? Is that kind of what you're Yeah. I think that like one of the approaches that I find really helpful actually is a kind of a philosophical approach that comes out of or like is sort of the basis of acceptance and commitment therapy. And that philosophical approach is called functional contextualism, which essentially the kind of basis of that philosophy is that instead of asking whether something is true or not, that is often, especially with psychological phenomena, it's more helpful to ask the question like, how is it working for me given like the life I want to live and what's important to me?
Yeah.
And the reason I think that that's really important is that sometimes we get lost in these questions of like, is something true or not? And especially broad philosophical things like solipsism or the nature of the self can be like philosophical rabbit holes that you can just spend like years going down the rabbit hole and never really get like a firm answer to it. And
Yep.
so you might want to take a step back and say like, is that rabbit hole actually leading me to live the life that I want to live? Or is that rabbit hole actually like maybe leading to problems that I'm spending so much time asking those questions because sometimes
Yeah.
they're not answerable in a way. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I think I don't know if we have data on like that question long term, but I would say that I think clarifying if you do get back into meditation, what would be your goals? What are you trying to achieve? And what are you doing in meditation would be a big part of the answer to that because there's a lot of different approaches to take to meditation. And if you're um, if you're doing a practice that is all about deconstructing your sense of self, then maybe that's what it would do. But if you do a practice that's
Okay.
more about grounding and generating loving kindness or something, then that might not interfere with your sense of self. So
Well,
it kind of depends, I guess. It's sort of
a
yeah.
couple thoughts. One is I have created something called My Map, which is my meditation assessment process. It's now an online course. And it's basically just, it's a pimped out Excel sheet with going down like all the reasons that you want to meditate, all the functions that it has, like it's calming, it's centering, it gives me a comprehensive worldview, it gives me membership in certain groups, it gives me a lineage, whatever it is for you, being very, very specific about that. And then going across are all the different practices that you've tried and,
Mhm.
in the past and now, like how are they doing in terms of meeting each of those needs? And I color code it. So, green is like good, keep doing it, go. Yellow is like, like it's complicated and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, not sure, more, investigate more. Red is like, this has caused me harm in the past. And then you can kind of step back and look at the patterns. And if it's mostly, oranges and reds, and maybe look for something else. Stick with the greens. And then I usually have another column that's like outside of meditation, like what helps me feel like I'm a member of a group, what helps me have calms me down, like what are the other things that you do, and can you do more of those
Right.
things? So it's a very systematic process, and it'll kind of help get to these a lot of the questions that Nick is talking about. Um, and then I will also share a completely different thought stream, which is that inner child self has been a very important piece in a lot of people's recovery. And for a couple reasons. One is that it tends to be a sign that people have changed their locus of control from external authority to internal.
Yes.
And, basically, like that is the piece, that's what gets people into trouble, is that people who are very attuned to the external standards of the world, how do I get an A and how do I avoid punishment in this situation? Makes you extremely high achieving, makes you turn into a Brown professor. And, it also gets you into trouble, especially in meditation, because you never ever, you know, tailor your practice for what you need. You do it based on the external demands. So when the little self comes out, she gets kind of pissed when you do that because you're basically overriding her and you're betraying her. And so whenever you get this question, you should ask her. You're like, I'm gonna go do this like retreat. What do you think? She'll tell you. And if you don't ask her and you do it anyway, she's gonna pull all kinds of strings and give you panic attacks and dissociation and things like that. So, Nick, any final comments?
Yeah, well, really was nice to hear from all of you and to share all of the things that you shared and feel free to continue the conversation. I'm going to be at Cheetah House and I also if you ever want to talk to me in more length, feel free to schedule a consultation with me. But yeah, it's been a real pleasure having this with all of you and look forward to continuing these conversations.